Good evening and welcome to Know Before You Grow. I'm Dan Like, and as always, thanks to Dave Alden and Sharon Kirk for doing the real work here, and I will pass the mic over to Dave in just a moment. But before we do that, a few housekeeping notes. First, we often try to recognize the elected and appointed and city staff who show up here. And it's a running gag that we always leave somebody out. But this evening I see at least John Shribs here, city council person. Hi, John. Upcoming events tomorrow at Aquas at noon. We will have a Petaluma Urban Chat freewheeling conversation, no agenda. Just show up and we'll talk. We don't have anything else on the calendar as right now, but if you go to urbanchat.org and sign up for the mailing list, you will get announcements of upcoming events, as well as Dave's amazing email with all of the weekly events, which are awesome, and you should definitely see them. Yeah, Zoom bombing. We have been Zoom bombed before. We will get Zoom bombed occasionally. If the screen goes weird, if you start hearing Russian national anthems or whatever played over it, people drawing on it, I'll lock the meeting down, try to find the offenders and kick them. If you get kicked accidentally, apologies, ask to be let back in. If you or somebody else is having trouble being let back in, please answer the chats in the chat section, because I use that to kind of vet people if we've had problems. Other than that, I'm trying to leave it open because of my eyes flashing all over to try to monitor who's doing what while I'm talking is distracting for everybody. And with that, we'll have, I think, turn it over to Dave and let Dave Alden introduce this evening's topic and video.
I'll do that. Thanks, Dan. Hey, thanks for everybody who's here this evening. I see we're still wandering in, but we'll get moving here. What we're going to do this evening is watch a video from a University of Washington professor, Greg Colburn, regarding homelessness and the work he and his co-author did regarding causes of homelessness. Afterwards, we have Walker Williams of Scannell Development, who will, with me, will try to respond to questions regarding what we should do with the message that Colburn shares with us. I have read Colburn's book, found it a bit dense at times, or a bit heavy going, but that's because it was so rigorous in its statistical approach that it was what it should have been. It was actually odd the way I came across the book. Kevin McDonald and I, during his campaign, kept passing back and forth references to the book without realizing we were all talking about the same book. Eventually, it became evident one of us should read it, and because I seem to have more free time on my schedule than the mayor does, I ended up being the one to buy it and get through it. It was on his table to read, but he wasn't going to get to it this week, so I borrowed it back to have it here at hand for this evening. It'll go back to him when he returns next week. So with that said, I guess I did reach out to Greg Colburn about his willingness to speak with us in person this evening via Zoom. He said he's just getting so many speaker requests, he couldn't do it. He sent me some videos he thought would work. One of them I thought was dead on. I even reached out to him one more time to ask whether he could do the Q&A after the video. And he's in his family, with his family on vacation in Florida for the week. So he again regretfully declined, but he sent us his best wishes. And I think with that, Dan, we're ready to go.
For people who live in these communities. So I'm going to share my slides here. And then I'm going to spend about 30 minutes talking about the book, the arguments that we make, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end here. So this is the book. The University of California Press out of Berkeley is our publisher. They've been a great partner. My co-author Clayton Aldern is a data scientist, and so he is responsible for a lot of the visual graphics that you see in the book. He's also a journalist, and so we had a great collaboration on this book. He writes a lot on climate change right now, but before he was doing that, he was actually working for Pierce County in Tacoma on issues related to homelessness. So he's been a really good colleague throughout this process. So one of the central questions that we always talk about with homelessness is what causes homelessness. And as someone who is a social scientist and I do research for a living, causation is a question that we think a lot about. And so what causes X, what causes Y? And those questions can be difficult. Sometimes they're easy, sometimes they're more difficult. So if I asked you what causes a pencil to fall to the ground, most people on this call would probably say, well, it's gravity. And there wouldn't be a lot of dispute around that causation. So that's in the physical sciences, that might be a little bit easier to dissect. If I ask you what causes someone to be admitted to Harvard or not be admitted to Harvard, that's more complicated, right? There are all sorts of factors. Good education, might be smart, might not be smart, parents went there, whatever the case may be. The point is that when we get into the social world, causality typically is what we would call complex causality, meaning there are all sorts of forces coming together to produce a particular outcome. And when we start to ask general questions like, why would someone get into Harvard? We kind of have to scratch our head and say, well, it's complicated, right? A lot of things have happened that potentially have produced that outcome. That's absolutely true when we talk about homelessness. I've probably, I don't know how many people I've interviewed who are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness. And I can tell you every story is unique, right? There's not one cookie cutter pathway to homelessness. The stories are tragic, they're difficult to listen to. And so I try to approach this with a level of humility when we talk about the individual trajectories into homelessness, because the reality is there's so many different ways that a series of circumstances can come together to produce this outcome. But that doesn't stop us. We always want to think about what causes homelessness, and we'll see this all the time. And so throughout the United States, we conduct a survey, and COVID has disrupted this a little bit, but generally speaking, we conduct an annual survey called the point in time count, which is to the best of our ability, estimate the number of people experiencing homelessness in each community around the country. And so the continuum of care is the regional authority that funnels federal money for homelessness program, but also is responsible for that survey. And so as part of that survey or census, I would say, we also conduct a survey in which we ask people questions about their experience related to homelessness. And one of them is, what produced your bout of homelessness? Basically, why are you homeless? And what we'll see is people respond, I lost my job, I'm addicted, I got evicted, my partner and I divorced or separated, I can't pay my rent, or I got in an argument with my roommate. And there are all sorts of other explanations here. And so this is the list that will be, for example, gets published in the Seattle Times. And we say, okay, well then, and people will read this and say, well then these are the things that cause homelessness. And therefore, if we want to end homelessness, we should get rid of these things. And I always cringe a little bit when I read this. It's complicated because we obviously want to understand and appreciate and honor the responses of people experiencing homelessness. But I fundamentally do not believe that divorce and separation are the primary driver of homelessness. If so, we should have far more people experiencing homelessness, right? Given the rate of divorce in this country, half of marriages ending in divorce. So so this causes us to think a little bit more deeply about what are we actually getting when we ask people, why are you homeless? What do those responses mean? I would argue, and we argue in the book, that these are, I would call these things precipitating events more than root causes. And by precipitating an event, I mean, this is something particular, unique happens, and that event then produced a bout of homelessness. I think that those precipitating events can be different than the underlying root cause of homelessness. Okay? And because people are talking about these events that produced it, I got in an argument with my roommate. Roommate kicked me out. I had nowhere to go, and now I'm in a homeless shelter. I would call that a precipitating event. Okay? There's something else going on structurally that helps to explain why did that particular precipitating event produce an outcome of homelessness for that individual, but maybe not for someone else. So the example that I like to use here, this analogy is the analogy of the game of musical chairs, which hopefully you've played at some point or your kids have played. The idea being you have 10 people in a circle, you have 10 chairs, the leader plays some music. While the music is on, people walk around in a circle. The leader takes one chair out, so now you have 9 chairs and 10 people. When the music stops, everyone has to get a chair. And when the music stops, one person by definition will be left without a chair. And so in this case, Mike was on crutches after spraining his ankle, and he was unable to move quickly when the music stopped, and therefore he lost the game and didn't find a chair. And so if we were to interview Mike and the other competitors after this game, we'd say, what caused Mike's chairlessness? I would bet you most people would say, Mike had a bad ankle. He was on crutches. That's why he lost the game. And that's true. It's absolutely true. Within the confines and the rules of that game, Mike's ankle injury caused his chairlessness. But there's a more fundamental question, which is that really the reason? Is that really the reason why he lost the game? I would argue that the reason he lost the game is that we didn't have enough chairs. And had we had 10 chairs, Mike, even though it might have been difficult, it might have taken him longer than other people, he would have found a chair. Okay. So what happens is when we have these structural conditions of scarcity, we end up identifying with the personal vulnerability far more so than the structural deficit of chairs, which explains why we think about Mike being on crutches as explaining his chairlessness, which is why we also talk about people's poverty or addiction or whatever the case may be when we talk about homelessness. So we know that there are a number of individual risk factors for homelessness: drug use, mental illness, poverty. If I'm an addict, if I'm mentally ill, if I'm experiencing poverty, I'm far more likely to be homeless than someone else who doesn't have those conditions. There's no doubt about that. But we also know that those conditions produce homelessness at much higher rates in some places like Seattle, but not in other places. And so the question is, what is going on here? We also know that a relatively small percentage of the population, so if we think about chronic unsheltered homelessness, and if you've been to Seattle recently and you walked around downtown and you saw some people who were clearly having issues, that's the population we're talking about. That's about 16% of the total population of homelessness in King County. And so there's, 84% of the people are not those people we see on the street. They're living in shelters or they're living in cars. They're not mentally ill. They're not addicts. But we just see this visible part of homelessness. And so there's this experiential side of things that ends up distorting our perception or understanding of the homelessness crisis. So the fundamental question that we try to answer in the book is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? So for example, Seattle has 4 to 5 times the per capita rate of homelessness of Chicago, two seemingly vibrant cities with very, very different trajectories related to homelessness. So an obvious question would be, if there are these individual risk factors for homelessness or individual vulnerabilities, does Seattle have a big homelessness problem because we have more people with those individual vulnerabilities? That's a perfectly reasonable and logical explanation for our crisis. So we test that in the book. Turns out the answer is no. We don't have a disproportionate number of people with these vulnerabilities. The point is that the vulnerabilities manifest themselves very differently in some locations versus others. It's worse to be poor in a rich city like Seattle. It's better to be poor as it relates to homelessness, not that it's good to be poor anywhere. But the consequences of poverty in Seattle are very different than in Detroit, Michigan. So this is a book about cities, not about people, and it doesn't mean that people aren't important. They absolutely are. A lot of homelessness research is focused on people. The purpose of this book is to understand what the heck is going on in Seattle and San Francisco and LA and New York. Why is it so bad there? That's what we're trying to understand. And the thesis that we reach is that tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities, just as not having enough chairs in the game of musical chairs accentuates Mike's ankle injury. And these individual vulnerabilities then serve as a sorting mechanism or identifying who's likely to end up without housing or without a chair. So the fact that people who are addicted or mentally ill or poor end up homeless in a place like Seattle shouldn't surprise anyone. We've basically set up a game with not enough housing units and too many people, and therefore who's likely to end up without? It's those people. It's not the people working at Amazon. They're going to find housing, right? So we end up with vulnerabilities serving as an identifying mechanism as it relates to homelessness. So just to set the stage for you, one of the complicating things about looking at homelessness from jurisdiction to jurisdiction is that some places count at a county level, King County being one of those places. So the homelessness count in King County is about 12,000 people, 12,500, and that includes the city and surrounding suburb areas that are in King County. Okay. Other places count only along city lines: New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Boston. And generally speaking, because homelessness is more, the density of homelessness is greater in urban areas, if you're only counting within the city borders, your numbers, all else equal, will be higher. For that reason, we can't compare King County's numbers to New York City's numbers because we're comparing apples and oranges. And so we have to compare within counties and within cities. So what we do here is, these are the cities in our sample in the book. And what you'll see is that in places where they only count within the city boundaries, you can see the high cities are about 9 to 10 people per 1,000 experience homelessness. And then the low end, it's just below 2 in Indianapolis. So there's about a 5-to-1 ratio between the high and low per capita homelessness communities. In the counties, the numbers are lower, because the suburban locations tend to have lower rates of homelessness. But what's really interesting is you still have about a 5-to-1 ratio between the high jurisdictions, LA, Santa Clara, King County, Multnomah, which is Portland, and the low places over here. See, it's about 5-to-1. So the point of the book is, why do we have a 5-to-1 ratio? How can we possibly explain some places that are 5 times worse than other places in the United States? It's a pretty shocking variation, and we want to try to explore that and understand that. So we have 3 sets of explanations that we pursue in the book to hopefully help explain that regional variation. The first one is looking at some of these individual factors that we're all familiar with if we've done reading or read any press accounts of homelessness. The first one is poverty. I will never argue to anyone that poverty isn't a risk factor for homelessness. It absolutely is, right? If you don't have the resources needed to consume housing, you are far more likely to experience homelessness. But what's interesting is the question is, does the level of poverty in a community help to explain regional variation? And the answer to that question is no, and it's actually a pretty resounding no. And so I'm not going to do a lot of statistics or wonky stuff today, but the only thing I'm going to tell you is this: R-squared number is a measure of variation. And so what we're trying to do with poverty rates, and these are poverty rates on the x-axis here, what we're trying to see is, how does variation in poverty rates explain variation in rates of homelessness, which are on the y-axis or the vertical axis here. And so as R-squared gets closer to 1, we would say that a lot of the variation is explained. And if R-squared is basically at 0, you would say not very much variation is explained. And so in the social sciences, because causality is very complex, if we can get into 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, or up to 0.5, we'll start to say like, hey, there's really something here. But you'll see in a lot of our graphs that the R-squareds are really low, 0.05, 0.06. And we basically say at that point, there's just frankly not a lot of relationship here. So we're going to not use that as a credible explanation for variation. So poverty actually has some explanatory power, but it's actually in the opposite direction we would assume, which is the higher the poverty rate, here are communities with 30, 35, 40% of the people below the poverty line have actually relatively low rates of homelessness. And places with high levels of homelessness tend to have much lower rates of poverty. So the issue in San Francisco and Seattle is not that we have more poor people. In fact, we have fewer poor people than a place like Detroit or Cleveland, where the poverty rates are much higher. So it is not a disproportionate number of poor people being in our community that's causing homelessness. In fact, homelessness thrives in affluent communities with far lower rates of poverty, which is a somewhat counterintuitive result for a lot of folks when they first hear about this. This is rates of serious mental illness, and this is actually data at the state level, because the census, when they conduct, well, it's a related data set to the census, but we track mental illness and drug data far better at the state level than the community level. So what we're doing here is comparing variation in state rates of homelessness by variation in rates of serious mental illness. And what you'll see is there is some variation in rates of serious mental illness. Some places only 3% of the population, up to 6%. So there's twice as much mental illness in some states than others. But the point is when you plot all of those rates of mental illness against rates of homelessness, what you'll see is there's no relationship. So places with high rates of homelessness don't have more people experiencing mental illness, right? So that's not driving regional variation. The same is true with illicit drug use. Again, you can see the R-squared is 0.06, basically no relationship. There is some variation in rates of illicit drug use, but it has no correlation whatsoever to rates of homelessness. So it's not that we have more drug users in Washington or Oregon or California or other places with high rates of homelessness. Right? It's just the consequences of those individual vulnerabilities is a little bit different. And then this is substance use disorder, which is a little different than illicit drug use in the sense that this would include legal substances like marijuana or alcohol. And so if you're addicted to one of those substances, again, what we see is no relationship to homelessness. So the point here, again, just to really hammer this home, we don't have a problem because we have more people with these issues. That's just not the issue. That's not the explanation for the crisis that we see on the coast in the United States. So the second category of explanations we look at is local context. What is it about our community that's driving high rates of homelessness? I hear this all the time in meetings. There's something about Seattle. There's something about San Francisco. We're a magnet for people. We're a magnet because of our generosity, whatever the case may be. Weather is frequently mentioned. So here's weather. People always say to me, well, it's moderate, moderate weather on the West Coast causes homelessness. So I'll say, okay, that's fine. And it makes sense. I always come back to people and say, do you know the average high in Seattle in January is 39 degrees and it's raining? That's not terribly pleasant to be outside. And so the argument might hold in San Diego or LA, but I struggle with it in Seattle. But actually, when you look at the data, what you'll see is there's zero relationship between average January temperature and homelessness. There are cold places with actually relatively high rates of homelessness. New York and Boston are two prime examples. And there are also warm places in Florida and Texas that have very low rates of homelessness. And so it's easy to kind of track weather and homelessness when we think about LA or San Diego, but when you actually look at all the cities around the country, there are a lot of cases that don't fit that narrative, right? So the problem that we have in Seattle and in the Puget Sound region is not weather. That's not explaining our homelessness crisis. People also will say, well, we have generous benefits here. Therefore, people want to be homeless here or they will move here to take advantage of those generous benefits. And so what we do to look at that is we look at the primary federal welfare program, which is called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And this typically goes to women with children. And so what we do is actually look at rates of family homelessness here to see if there's any relationship between benefit generosity and homelessness. So TANF came to be in 1996 under President Bill Clinton's welfare reform policy. And one of the elements of that is a lot of decision-making was devolved to states. And so states can determine the relative generosity of those welfare benefits. So it actually makes it kind of an interesting case for testing variation. And so what we do is we look at the maximum welfare benefit state by state, and we divide by the housing cost of living in each location to get a sense for the purchasing power of that benefit. And what you'll see is there's huge variation, some very stingy states, some very generous states relative to the cost of housing. But what you see is when you plot that against homelessness, what you see is there's basically no relationship. Right? So we don't see a lot of evidence that generous benefits in the form of the primary welfare benefit here that varies state by state derives or has any explanatory power for variation in rates of homelessness. The other way we looked at this was we looked at low-income migration rates. And so, I've heard so many times, if I had a nickel for every time someone told me that this is a migration story, that people are moving here to experience homelessness. So we actually looked at low-income migration rates into each community in our sample. And what we see is that there are poor people moving to every city and county in the country, but there is no relationship. And in fact, there's a negative relationship between low-income migration and homelessness. So it's not that we have more poor people moving to Seattle or King County that explains our problem. In fact, low-income migration is pretty darn low in places with high rates of homelessness. You'll see it in this upper left-hand quadrant here, right? You see super low, less than 10% low-income migration into those communities. And much higher rates into places like Cleveland and Detroit, Philadelphia, Baltimore, have much higher migration rates of low-income folks. So again, this migration story driving the crisis just doesn't hold a lot of water. The other thing that people say is, well, it's left-leaning politics, and Governor Newsom from California got into a very public spat with then President Trump over this issue. And Trump had been saying, well, it's Democrats that are blamed for this because Democrats run California, which is a true statement. Democrats do run California. But what's interesting is when we plot all the cities in our sample, generally speaking, Democrats run cities in the United States. And you can think that's a good thing or a bad thing. But the point is that Democrats run cities in the United States. Republicans have been in charge briefly in Miami and San Diego, and Mayor Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, was an independent. But generally speaking, Democrats are in charge. So if Democratic policies are to blame for the homelessness crisis or in California and Seattle and other places, we have to ask, why don't Chicago and Cleveland then have a huge problem? Because they have been run by Democrats for generations, huge Democratic strongholds. So the point is, again, it's just not a very credible explanation for this regional variation that we're trying to explain. So the final explanation that we pursue is housing market conditions, and this is the one where we start to see some real explanatory power. This is median contract rent in each of the communities in our sample in both cities and counties, and what you see is an upward sloping line, meaning more expensive housing markets equal much higher rates of homelessness. And you see the R-squareds are far higher than what we've seen for the other variables, right? This is where we start to really get some explanatory power. A related variable, it's not independent, is vacancy rates. What you'll see here is that as vacancy rates go down, meaning the availability of housing is less abundant, homelessness goes up. And the converse is also true. As vacancy rates go up, generally what we'll see is much lower rates of homelessness. And so what I would say is these are related variables. Vacancy rates have an impact on rents. But if you were to give me the vacancy rate and the rent for a community and didn't tell me anything else about that community, I could, with a relatively high degree of confidence, tell you that this is a place that's going to likely have a problem with homelessness or not, based on those two conditions. And so the point is that this helps to explain the regional variation, the housing market conditions, and then you overlay individual vulnerabilities on top of that to say, this is why addiction, poverty, mental illness in Seattle might produce homelessness while it may not in another place, because housing is a lot more, is a lot cheaper and more abundant, or more available, I guess I would say. And so the question that we should all ask ourselves is then, why do some places have expensive rents and low vacancies? And, you know, I think a common narrative in our region, generally speaking, is that we have been a destination for a lot of people moving to the Pacific Northwest because of our robust job market, right? And so do we have a crisis in the Puget Sound region because Amazon has moved a bunch of people here and hired a bunch of people? Partly, but what's interesting is when you plot population change in each of these communities, what you'll see is zero relationship between population change and homelessness, which really surprised me. I've said over and over, this is the one chart that I thought I'd screwed up. And so I ran the numbers 3 times. And each time it came out the same way. So I knew I was doing it correctly, but it would just surprise me. I really thought there'd be more of a relationship between population change and homelessness. But when I dug into the numbers, what I found is there's other places that are growing really fast too, like Charlotte, North Carolina, and other places in the Sun Belt that are growing at rates similar to Seattle, King County, but don't have the same problem with homelessness. So what's going on here? So the point is that the demand side for housing, which is population growth, is part of the story, but we also need to be thinking about the supply side of housing. Is there enough housing to accommodate people who are moving here? So to do this, what we did is to kind of summarize our findings here is to create a typology of cities. And so I warned you at the beginning, I was only going to do a little bit of statistics, and I'm only going to do a tiny bit of economics for you, which, you know, this might be a good time to exercise International Nap Day if you don't want to listen to this. But there's a notion in economics called elasticity. And in this case, we're interested in the elasticity of supply. And the idea with this measure is when the price of a good changes, what we're interested in is what is the supply response to that change in price. And so the example that I like to use is pens. If the price of pens goes up a whole bunch tonight, let's say it goes up 10 times tonight, what's going to happen tomorrow? Well, the manufacturers of pens are going to supply a whole bunch of pens because it's a profit opportunity for them. So they'll go to 2 shifts or 3 shifts, and they'll convert pencils to pens or whatever the case may be. The point is the supply is going to go up a lot. So what we would say is the supply elasticity of pens is really, really high. When we think about a different product like housing, generally speaking, the supply elasticity is going to be a lot lower, because if the price of housing goes up by 10 times tonight, what's going to happen tomorrow? What change will happen? Nothing. Why? Because housing takes a long time to build. We need to find land, and we have to get a permit. We have to get proper zoning, and we have to get a contractor and supplies and all that stuff. Right? So the point is, generally speaking, supply elasticity isn't real high for housing. But from community to community, the price elasticity changes meaningfully. And the 2 drivers of that are the regulatory environment. How easy is it to get a permit? What is the zoning situation there? And the topography. Where you have mountains and water, it's harder to respond to increased demand for housing because you just can't keep sprawling. Right? So Topeka, Kansas, it's easy to build more housing if more people move there because you just keep going up and it's cheap. And the regulatory environment is pretty accommodating. San Francisco is Exhibit A for super, super, super inelastic housing supply. You've got mountains, you've got water, and then you've got an incredibly difficult regulatory environment in which to construct housing, which explains why they have the worst housing crisis in the United States. That combined with obviously demand for housing in terms of having a massive tech boom in that area. It's really a perfect storm of bad factors for a housing crisis. So what we do here is plot two of these factors. On the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we have change in population. So these are the cities on the right, communities that have been growing quickly over the last decade. On the left, these are the ones that are shrinking, generally the Rust Belt. And on the y-axis or the vertical axis, we have housing supply elasticity. So 1 is kind of the benchmark. Numbers above 1 would suggest that you have a pretty elastic supply, meaning as prices go up, as demand goes up, you'll build a lot of housing. Once you get below 1, what you'll see is you don't build a lot of housing when people move there. And what you'll see is every one of the cities that has inelastic housing supply borders water. In Chicago, it's Lake Michigan, but otherwise you've got cities that are, bordering the ocean, or in our case, Puget Sound. And the numbers in parentheses are the rental market vacancy rates. And so what you'll see is that you've got really rapidly growing cities in the Sun Belt, but they have very, very high supply elasticities for housing. So what's happened is they have been able to maintain relatively high vacancy rates, even though they've had growth rates that are similar to what we're seeing in Seattle. So the bottom right quadrant here, which is rapid growth and very inelastic housing supply, is the perfect storm for a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis. It should not surprise us that Seattle, Boston, and San Francisco are 3 of the worst cities when it comes to homelessness in the United States, along with New York and LA. The only reason they're over here is that these cities are so large that their population growth isn't as robust as these smaller cities, but they're still growing. 5% population growth in LA is a lot of people. So if you basically grab these 2 quadrants, what you have is this is where you're gonna have a housing crisis, and as a result, also a crisis of homelessness. So how do you have low rates of homelessness? One is you can have industrial decline. You can be Detroit, where 30% of the community leaves over a generation, which leads to really low housing costs and high vacancies. But that's really not a trajectory that anyone is probably aspiring to, including our new planner in Bellingham. Or you can build a lot of housing in response to high growth, which is what the Sun Belt has done. But if you're going to continue to grow and have inelastic housing supply, that's where you're going to end up in these places with high rates of homelessness. So if you buy the argument, and you may or may not, I would love to hear your opinions on this, but if you buy the argument that a lack of housing and a lack of affordable housing is driving this, what do we do? Well, I would argue that right now we are investing significant dollars in what I would call operating investments to fund housing support, maintenance, and services. This would be shelter systems and other crisis response. And we need to continue to do that. I think we have a moral and ethical obligation to do that. But we need to be clear that those investments are really a Band-Aid. They are not getting at the root cause, and we will be continuing to treat the issue rather than fundamentally ending it. And if we want to fundamentally end this, what we need significant capital investments from public-private sources, from philanthropic sources, to construct more housing, and specifically more housing that's affordable. Because if we fail to do that, we will continue to put millions and millions of dollars into, sorry, my phone's ringing here. We will continue to put money into these Band-Aids and crisis response, which is important, but it will continue to perpetuate this crisis. And so what we need investments in housing, and where housing is difficult to construct, we need to have changes in regulations and land use policy to make sure that we can create the housing units that are needed to accommodate all the people who want to live here, not just people experiencing homelessness, but the people moving to your communities for new job opportunities, et cetera. We know that this is a very, very in-demand region of the country. I have no reason to suspect, unless something radically changes, that our population growth is going to stall. And therefore, what we have to think about is how are we going to continue to accommodate that growth? One of the problems is that if we don't construct enough housing, you know who it hurts? It hurts the people who are here right now. So in Seattle, for example, as Amazon hired tens and tens and tens of thousands of highly compensated people, those people moved to Seattle. They were able to get housing just fine because we have a market-based housing allocation system, and they have more money than anyone else. And so they found housing, and then who's left without housing? It's the people who've been here for a long time. And so when we say we didn't build enough housing to accommodate the people who moved here for Amazon, in fact, we didn't build enough housing to keep people here who got pushed out once Amazon folks moved to Seattle. And this dynamic is happening in communities all over the country. Boise is seeing it right now as new manufacturers move there, and tech people are moving from California to work remotely in Boise. They're buying houses, they're paying high rents, and ultimately the people who've been in Boise for a long time are now saying, whoa, I can't afford to stay here anymore, and there's not enough housing, right? And so this dynamic is not just a Seattle dynamic, it's happening all over the place. And so this is regional, but the point of this is housing is expensive. And so an estimate by McKinsey based up for King County was we needed, and this is a couple of years old, so these numbers have gone up because of inflation, but about $10 billion over 10 years, meaning $1 billion each year to construct housing for, to construct 37,000 new units of housing for very low income people. We spend about $260 million a year right now, so it'd be a quadrupling of that. So it's a big number. And so people say, wow, $1 billion a year, that's really, really unbelievable. But when you think about what our region has done, we just passed $54 billion for transit, light rail over the next 25 years. So the point is that we aren't scared of making big investments. One of the issues that we have is that transportation is considered to be a public good. And therefore, and it wasn't easy, right? There was a lot of work that went into it. So I'm not suggesting it's easy, but it's easier to make big investments when people see this as a public good. The problem is we see housing as a private good. And we're now starting to see as a community the consequences of looking at housing as solely as a private good. Ultimately, it is infrastructure. I believe housing is infrastructure because the ability for us to have police and firefighters and teachers and all those essential services that make a community work doesn't work if they can't afford to live in that community. And so I would absolutely argue that housing is infrastructure. And does that mean we should give a free unit to everyone? No, I don't necessarily believe that. But the point is that if you've got a significant percentage of your community who can't afford to live there, who want to live and work and raise a family there, something's wrong. And I believe that fundamentally on our coast, the housing market has absolutely broken down such that it is not providing access to communities the way that it needs to. And so I would argue, getting back to this point of homelessness, that I think there's a very strong argument that there is a structural explanation for this crisis. And that structural explanation is the way that our housing markets work or don't work in these communities. And then if we continue to diagnose homelessness as a problem of the individual, and then we want to try to treat individuals, we will undermine our efforts to prevent and end homelessness. This doesn't mean we shouldn't provide services to people who need them. We absolutely should. My point is that drug treatment will not get us out of this crisis. A lot more housing will get us out of this crisis. And when people say, well, this seems insurmountable, how are we going to do this? I would say there is a bright spot here. About 10 to 15 years ago, the United States decided, as veterans were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, said, we don't feel that it's right that people who have served the country in the armed forces should experience homelessness when they return. And people from both political parties agreed. And what do? We cut veteran homelessness in half over the last 10 years. Pretty dramatic fall. And how did we do it? We gave them housing. So we have plenty of evidence to know that if we give people housing, homelessness is going to fall. Will it solve every case? No, it won't. But rather than having these huge per capita rates, we could cut this dramatically if we simply have enough housing throughout our community to ensure that that the third grade teacher can afford to live in your community, as well as people who are working at the minimum wage. And so that is the story. This is the book. If you are interested, I can get you a 30% discount here, and we can email this out to you directly from the publisher. If you buy right from Amazon, you won't get the discount, but you can if you go right to UC.
So Dave, I think that's about where you asked me to run to. You're muted. You're still muted.
Now I'm unmuted. Thank you. No, you stopped exactly where I'd hoped you would, Dan. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
I don't believe that our other participant in the Q&A is here yet, which is, I had told him 7:45, so he's not officially late, but I wish he was here regardless.
Okay.
But I'm going to assume, well, two things I want to say. One, if you have questions, please start throwing them into chat. I've seen a couple of things that we could probably respond to, but we could probably use more content there. And then second, I attended last night the workshop that was put on by Scannell for the 500 Hopper Street project. And it dawned on me as I was sitting there listening to the conversation that there is a Venn diagram way to talk about how land use approvals work in Petaluma, specifically housing approvals. That to me was meaningful, but perhaps I'm just a geek. Nonetheless, I did spend 5 minutes today sketching up what I was seeing, and I'd like to share that and talk about it, just because I'm expecting part of the conversation or part of the thinking that will result from what we've heard this evening is, how do we get more housing in this community? What are the hurdles? So let me throw this up here while we're waiting for Walker to join us and tell you what my thoughts are. And if you find them useful, we can maybe make this graphic a little more presentable. There we go. Can you see that now?
I cannot. You have not shared yet. Now we're getting to it. There
Now.
we go. Yay.
Okay.
Cool.
Hey, it takes me a moment here. I'm still learning things on Zoom. Like I say, Venn diagram is the approach I'm taking here because it just made sense to me. And anything we do, there's going to be different sets of priorities, different things people want out of a process. And what we are typically looking for is the outcomes that fall within the shared priorities of everyone. The problem with housing, and well, maybe all land use, but housing is the conversation this evening, is that we've got a real challenge with finding that common area. And the way I see it is we have two different Venn diagrams. Starting in the upper left, we have three different constituencies. We have city planning, which is implementing the zoning code. We have the council and the planning commission, who often have some different perspectives. And don't take it too seriously. I don't show a lot of overlap there. I wasn't trying to be rigorous in my mathematical presentation here. But the council and the planning commission can have different priorities than the zoning code might. We've seen that with regard to the Scanel project in the January negative comments from the planning commission regarding the Scanel proposal that was generally aligned fairly well with the zoning code. And then we've got another group, and I'll call them Urban Chat because that's who we are, but there are other folks who would be part of this, who are looking beyond what the zoning code is. They're looking toward the financial and climatic sustainability of this community 30 years from now, which we fear the current zoning code is really not doing very well. So these three groups all have their own agendas, their own priorities, but I would argue that with a little bit of work, we can find a place in the middle where those three can overlap and come up with solutions that all three find acceptable. The problem is down here, we have a different Venn diagram. We have the applicant or the developer, pick your term, the guy who's truly, in front of us, presenting the project, trying to get through the entitlement process. We have the investors, and this is a group we often don't talk about, but most developers, virtually all developers, don't have money in the bank to build projects. They need to come up with a proposal that gets approved, and then investors are willing to put money into it because, and investors tend to be very conservative. They only want to invest things that made money, invest in type of projects that made money 10 years ago. That's a challenge, always a challenge to us. And then you have the neighbors who are often, hey, we don't want dense housing next to us. We want something that looks like us. We want something that supports our property values. So those three, just like the three in the upper left-hand corner, have their own agendas, their own priorities. But there's probably, if they work at it, an area that does align with all three. So the problem is now we have two different Venn diagrams, two different areas of concurrence that are not very close to each other. That's where ultimately where our housing problem is. We don't know how to bring those two together. Now, if what you're proposing here is a Walmart, the answer is real easy. You don't approve the Walmart, it goes away, it doesn't happen. That's simple. Housing, there's a complication, which is this thing in the lower left here, regional housing needs allocation, that is telling us we need to facilitate nearly 2,000 homes over the next 8 years, or we may face sanctions beyond that. In the past, they were never very rigorous with the sanctions. They are now saying they will be. So we've got a ticking clock telling us we need to get this area in the lower right somehow aligned with the upper left, and that's a challenge. That's nearly an impossibility, but it can't be an impossibility because RENA tells us it can't. So ultimately, upper right now, this is a complex situation. We have to acknowledge it's complex. We have to embrace the complexity of it, and we have to look for solutions within that complexity. We are going to be making some compromises to bring it all together. They are going to be compromises that perhaps nobody likes, but I don't see any way forward except for that. Again, this is just the way mind works. My mind works. If it makes sense to you, tell me that tomorrow, email me, whatever. We can discuss it further. We can build on this, but I think I just found this a very useful way to think about where we are, where we have to go. So with that, I am very hopeful that Walker has now joined us.
I am not sure where the, let me go run down the participants list. I see Walker at the very bottom of the list. Hopefully he's here and can join us.
Walker, are you there? Can you turn on your camera? Hello, Walker.
So, well, I see the camera now.
Oh, there we go. Hey, how you doing today? You're still muted. There
Is
we
that
go.
better?
That's
there
better.
we go. Yes.
Okay. Excellent.
Dan, do you want to maybe
Sorry,
be the first one? So, go.
I don't know that I have any particular questions. Where I was going, there are some kind of specific to projects that aren't Walkers in, Sheila asked, Haystack was mentioned, and is that a viable project? And I don't know if we want to start there or if we want to start about kind of the larger topic somewhere.
Well, that's an easy question to answer. When last we heard it was not viable, Haystack, the developer there, Pacifica Development out of San Diego, had gotten cost estimates from contractors. It came in about $30 million above what the investors were willing to put into it to get it built. And 30 million was a major hurdle to overcome. I continued to talk to the Pacifica folks regularly. They came back with a dumbed down version of the plan, which I really disliked. I hated to lose their initial vision. But even then, apparently they couldn't make the numbers work. They haven't come back to the city now in 2.5, 3 years. So they are still entitled, but by every indication, it's not viable. It's even possible the entitlement will expire and it'll be years before somebody tries again. So that's starting off on a bummer.
And then the other comment in the chat, and I think we can go a couple places from this, is Jerry mentioned that just under 3,000 homelessness in Sonoma County, generally in the past 5 years, after the spike from the 2008 situation leveled out. We've heard the number of roughly $800,000 per unit. That's $2.4 billion to house all of Sonoma County's homeless. But I think that, I've said many times that affordable housing isn't what you build now, it's what you built 50 years ago. And there are an awful lot of people living one per room in big old Victorians. So it's probably a lot smaller number than that. It's probably closer to, say, what we just spent on the 101 widening, 900,000, $1 billion, except that we'd actually get people in homes rather than further climate destruction for that. Yeah. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that out there.
Anyway, actually, before we go much further, I probably should have allowed Walker a better chance to introduce himself. Coming in late, I sort of gave you a short shrift there, Walker. Do you want to talk to us a bit? You're again muted. Doesn't look like it, but you are.
Okay, is that better?
You got it.
Okay. I've spoken to your group a few times. My name is Walker Williams. I'm the development manager for Skinnell Properties. We're working on the 39-acre site at 500 Hopper Street, immediately behind the Mary Isaac Center and on Hopper Street. So yeah, that's what we're working on. We've owned the property for 4 years, and we've definitely had our fair share of entitlement challenges. So I think that was I know the topic today was about homelessness, and I think the angle was because there's all types of different reasons why there could be a homeless situation in any given city. But I think because we don't have enough homes to go around is what the I believe Greg was the author's name of the book, what he was kind of getting at. So, I mean, I was wanted to be here tonight to basically just share the challenges that we've had. And I just created something very briefly that I could share on my Excel if you're okay with me sharing my screen.
Go for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna do this. All right, can you guys see this Excel?
There you go.
Okay. So some of these numbers are guesstimates. We don't know when we're going to get an entitlement or if we will get an entitlement. We hope we will at some point, so we can help, put somewhat of a dent in the housing crisis in Northern California and specifically in the North Bay and Petaluma. But what we're working on is, here's a real world example where we have a project that we proposed in January, and you just alluded to it, Dave, where we've, we're aligned with the general requirements of the zoning code, the smart code, and all the things that come along with that, like size of lot, size of house, et cetera. And we proposed that to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission told us that it wasn't dense enough, and that we needed to reduce parking, all things that are important to the community, and that honestly, we support, but we're also trying to make a project that makes sense, because there have been many projects that, maybe not many, there have been other projects in the past in Petaluma that have had a long, arduous road to an approval, and at the end of the day, you can't build it because it simply doesn't make sense for an investor to invest in a project that's going to lose them money. So I just wanted to show this example. So on the first line is what we proposed in January with 158 homes. And keep in mind that it's about 450 units total that we're proposing. 72 were affordable. Of those 72, those were low and medium, or I'm sorry, low to very low income housing, so 30 to 60% AMI. And then there are about 250 units that are multifamily, all for rent. The 158 are market rate for sale. So basically, this portion of the project is supposed to subsidize the remaining parts of the project. So please keep that in mind. So at 158 homes, what we're guessing right now is an average home sale price of about $900,000, and that's going to go down by 100 or 150 or up by 100, depending on the size of the home. So we're talking about anywhere from 1,500 square feet up to 2,400 square feet, and the 2,400 would have an ADU, a 400 or 500 square foot ADU. So in this scenario, our construction costs are up at about $435 per foot. So after you add all of that up, the sales of the homes would be $142 million. However, the construction costs for those homes would be $139 million. And so the difference, and I have in here, I've got the price of the land, the pro rata share for the cost of the roads, the cost of the park, the cost of improving the site itself. And so when you subtract the proceeds of the sales minus the costs, you land at about $2 million. Well, our annual taxes and our carry costs, which is how much we have to pay our lender to be able to, keep the project alive, are about $1.1 million. Now that's using a 5% interest rate. If you jump that up to 8% based on the last year's interest rate hikes, our annual carry costs jump up to about 1.7. And since we've held the project for 4 years and we're no closer to building a home than we were 4 years ago, you can see that the part of the project that's supposed to be subsidizing the remaining portion of the project is actually coming out as a negative. And then one of the things that the Planning Commission wanted us to pursue and look harder into was it more attached homes and less detached homes. Well, an attached home, even though we do get more homes, ultimately it's only about 12 more homes we can build. The cost of the home is a little bit less, $800,000. The cost of construction is a little bit less as well, $430 as opposed to $435, but pretty similar. So those total sales are 136. When you track to 146 of construction costs, you're actually 10 million in the hole before you even add annual taxes and carry costs from our lender. So as you can see, with attached homes, we're closer to 15 million in the hole. And again, these are round numbers. These could change, this number could change, this number could change because it's all based on the market. But really, this 158 and 170 is pretty set, and we feel pretty confident in some of these other numbers. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if we really want to put a dent in homelessness, and we think that the best way to do that is by putting more homes on the market, whether it's a high-priced home or a low-priced home, the best way to do it is just to get some homes built. And we can argue about certain things that we don't like about the parking ratio and things like that. But if we're just delaying the project and we're not really coming up, we're not getting any closer to the actual building the homes, I think the point of this is we're not really getting any closer to a solution. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share. And I think if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
And one thing that I would toss in there, and if Walker, if you want to stop sharing, or I can stop sharing for you, we can see faces again, is that when we ask, when we push back too hard against luxury housing, what we're subsidizing the subsidized housing on the lot. And if we push back too hard against luxury housing and have more mid-range units built, what we're asking is that people in the 100 to 120% of the area median income subsidize the people living at 60 to 80% of the area median income, rather than the people living or buying in at 150 or more of the area median income. Dave, correct me where I'm wrong.
No, I think you were fine. You were fine. The other point I wanted to add here is, of course, there's going to be a lot of skepticism about the numbers Walker just presented, and that's, the nature of, might developers, squeeze the numbers a little bit to present the story they want. But what I will point out is the number of projects in this community that have been entitled and never got built. We talked about Haystack earlier. You had Hines come in with a very aggressive proposal for the parcel next to the train station when they asked the city for what was effectively a $6 million subsidy by partial waiver of the affordable housing requirement. And the city said no. Hines said, we're done. We're not even going to talk anymore. We're out of here. You've got the apartments over next to Deer Creek Village that were entitled 2.5, 3 years ago and have yet to break ground. So there's a lot of evidence beyond what Walker has just said to say that it is hard to make projects financially feasible in this community. So that I'm trying to give you credibility there, Walker. Hope that helped.
And I see a couple messages in the chat kind of getting into I think the weeds on the finances of it. I'd like to just suggest that, yeah, it is complex. There are tax credits, there's various funds for affordable housing. These are big, broad strokes, but they're, in the ballpark, big, broad strokes. And I suspect that Walker hasn't deliberately eluded any, made any misrepresentations of what's going on. It costs money to build.
Yeah. So again, I put this together this afternoon. I have these numbers actually directly from some of the statistics that we built for this site. The number of homes is accurate. The home price, that's market.
Sure.
If this is not built for another 3 years and the market rate for a home, it goes up to 925 or 950,000, then we would sell a home for 925 or 950. If we had houses that were built today, it might be less than that. So it's really just, it's kind of up to the market. And, Dave and I had a nice chat last night about, why could we build something that's smaller? And by definition, it would be more affordable. And the numbers don't go up for building smaller houses. They go down. They're more in the red, is what I'm trying to explain. So, I think from a developer standpoint, kind of my main message tonight is just time kills deals. And if we're worried about specific environmental issues, I'm happy to talk about that. We go through an EIR process for a reason. So I feel like that's a pretty thorough process. And if you look at our project, just as an example, it's 39 acres. We've got about half of it is multifamily, or over half of it's multifamily, 15% is affordable. And then the part that's supposed to subsidize is the single family portion. So you've kind of got, you've got a little bit of every type of housing, from for sale to market rate and affordable. So the idea is we're creating a neighborhood that many different types of people can live in. We're not just creating, large homes that only one type of socioeconomic group can can join or be a part of. So we felt like it was a good proposal in January. So, hopefully we can come to some agreement with people that are detracting from the project, just in the effort of getting something approved.
Nice. So what, just as rough breakdowns, because I'm seeing Jerry ask it in the chat, and because I made the assertion earlier about who's subsidizing what part of the affordable housing, and we had a session, our last Know Before You Grow was a little bit about the funding of affordable housing, but how does that break down for you? You were going to have Eden, I think, build the affordable part of the unit. And so some of Eden's funding was going to come from various grants from other sources. Some of that was probably going to come from in lieu fees that the city has previously gotten. And some of that was going to come from your project. Do you have a notion of what that breakdown looked like?
So from us, we were basically we're giving them the land to build on.
Okay.
So, and then we're also building the road network around the land. So the road network itself, is, I don't have the number, but it's probably around $10 million to build all the roads, all the utilities for the 39 acres. And that's something that they can benefit from. So they will be going out to get grants. I don't know the amounts and I don't know who from, but various state grants for affordable housing. And that's why we're partnering with Eden Housing, because we're not experts in that realm. They've got, I know they have at least 2, maybe 3 existing affordable housing developments within the city of Petaluma. So we knew that they would be good partners for this project.
Yeah. And then just as a rough breakdown, I know there was some land set aside for parkland, some land that you're building on, some land for roads, and the land for the Eden project. Do you happen to know, like, percentage wise, what that breakdown was?
The amount of parks that is required by the general plan is 3.5 acres.
Okay.
So I think some of the pushback in January was we were double counting the acreage, the 3.5 acres that was also supposed to be for the trail along the riverfront.
Okay.
And I think that may have rubbed some people the wrong way. So we're working on a new proposal that will include 3.5 acres outside of the 75-foot setback from the river. And so I think that will improve the proposal. However, it probably will decrease the overall number of units of houses. So that's the I guess that's the friction between double counting. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Yes, we might be double counting an area that is in some areas within a 75-foot setback, but it also allows us to build more housing.
Right. And how large was the project total? Acres?
Well, the full amount of the property is 39 acres, but when you subtract the affordable block, which is 2.6 acres, the 7 acres along the river for the trail, 1.4 acres is submerged underwater in the Petaluma River, and what am I leaving out? The 3.5 acre park, you get down to about 17.5 acres. So only 45% of the project is buildable for single family.
Okay. Yeah, so those 17.5 acres are what you build there is supporting the land cost of the Eden project, part of the project.
It's supposed to. If we can find a way to make it in the black. I mean, at this point, I know there's definitely some skepticism about the numbers I've shown tonight, and that's fine. I completely understand. But at this point, we're just hoping to get a project built. We don't know if it's going to be profitable or not. It probably won't be. So at this point, we just want a project that's approvable.
Okay, yeah, the numbers that you're putting up, last session, we had somebody from Eden and somebody from Burbank talk with us, and they were giving numbers in the 800K per unit range as the cost to build. Now that they're building multifamily and they're building affordable, which has its own set of conditions put on it by grant sources, so that ran their cost up. a question I've got, which is kind of orthogonal to all this, and Dave, derail me if I'm going too far off the rails, is I've got an RS Means 2007 construction cost estimate book that I bought when we were looking for our house here. And I think it had said, about 125K, or 125 bucks a square foot as a cost for residential construction, not cheap residential construction, and then about a 1.2 factor regional, which seemed low at the time. But I'm looking at that and knowing that I paid 400 some odd bucks a square foot for my house, including the lot. So that suggests to me that a good portion of that 450 or 475 number that you had, I forget what the exact number was, but I knew that it was somewhere between the upper $400, $500 a square foot, is land costs. Am I on the ball on that, or am I way off? Or
no, that is just construction costs. The land costs we calculate separately.
Okay, holy cow. I'm feeling really good about getting into my house 15 years ago then.
If I could jump in with one point
Yeah.
there, and this is something that Colburn has in his book. He didn't mention it in his presentation this evening, but I really liked it when he said it. The building code keeps getting stiffer and stiffer. We now require sprinklers. We require 6-inch walls with insulation, all of which is great stuff. Seismic protection on buildings, all of which is great and appropriate stuff. But we do it at a time that the minimum wage isn't going up. Income inequality is increasing. His exact sentence, and I love it so much, I've never forgotten the page it was on. We mandate a minimum level of quality, but fail to provide sufficient resources to households who can't afford the housing constructed or maintained at this standard. By asking for more, has to be more and more, we are creating a housing problem just in itself, regardless of everything else. So again, not arguing against better housing standards, just saying we needed to relook at income inequality as that was happening.
Mm-hmm. So Lily asks, can you dive into the decision-making process for single-family houses versus apartments, and what the, a little bit more on how that works, aside from we push you to build multifamily, multi-story, and then the environmentalists scream about the view change.
Yeah, so that comes down to preference and marketability. We actually partnered with John Burns Real Estate Consulting. They're a national marketing and consultant that just looks at why people buy houses nationwide. And a couple of things were surprising to me. One thing is people look for storage space, and one place they look to store things outside of the kitchen is the garage. So we were trying to understand, well, can we do away with the 2-car garage? Can we get rid of a 1-car garage, and will people actually buy these houses? Because we've been feeling that pressure from groups inside Petaluma for a while. And I mean, what the numbers say is you can't. No, I mean that people aren't going to want to buy homes if there's not a 2-car garage. Now that might not be a popular opinion in this group or other groups, but that's today in 2023. Those are the facts. A backyard space. People want personal space. So even though we only have about 400 or 500 square feet in each of our backyards that we were proposing in January, for the detached homes, that 400 or 500 square foot space, even though it's barely enough room to throw a baseball or a barbecue, that's still personal space, and so that's very important to people. So we were basically taking something that people thought was very important and squishing it into the smallest box we could, call it a micro lot, and we were trying to make it marketable to people. So those are some of the high level. I mean, there's a ton of other takeaways, but basically we were finding those things that are at the very nature of a detached house. That's why people want those homes versus an attached townhome. And that's not for everybody. That's just for the majority of people.
Right. One of the things, if I were making the decision today rather than 15 years ago, I would probably join my various friends who live in condos in the city, and trying to get from here to there here is kind of a weird culture shift. So I get it.
I think there's a couple of questions in there about prefab housing. Walker, can you comment?
I haven't. Okay, I think prefab were actually cheaper. People would be building with it. I have toured a prefab facility in the last 12 months. I think it makes a lot of sense for multifamily, for large boxes, 3 or 4 stories tall, with kind of a general shape to it. Just a regular shape to it. So that might be something that we would entertain for multifamily. I think single family, they're getting better and they're getting more efficient with their single family homes. I'm not an expert on it though. I mean, it's definitely something as we got closer to an entitlement, we would start looking at ways to do that. I saw something recently where a contractor is using 3D printing to actually build the shell of the home, so that it's on site. That 3D printer is actually brought to the site and then starts basically pushing out cement for a stronger and more sound efficient shell to the house. So, all those things are on the table. I just don't know if the technology is there just yet for it to make sense. I think as you get a bigger neighborhood like ours, 150 plus homes, I think it would make sense to consider those types of technologies. If you're only building, 5 to 10, 15 homes, I don't think it makes as much sense. So we will be considering those types of things.
Well, Veronica asks, what about involving local architects? And I suspect that both that you are, but also that much of the economies of scale that you get with building a project like yours involves taking some fairly standardized plans and replicating those rather than doing custom homes on every site.
We haven't even gotten to architecture. That's something that we can talk about after an entitlement. I would love to talk about architecture. It's funny, as a developer, when we're hiring consultants, we always look for local, and our civil engineer actually lives in Petaluma. So, as far as engineering and land use, yes, really just the engineering of the site itself. I think it's most important to hire a local civil engineer who knows the engineering department, who knows code very well. The architect, we have hired a Bay Area architect. I know they've worked in Petaluma before. They're KTGY. I don't think they're local to Petaluma specifically, but we know they've done a lot of successful projects in the Bay Area and the North Bay. So, but yeah, I would love to get to architecture.
I noticed that Kevin has his hand up.
So I'm going to unmute. I think the thing is not so much, it's not so much hiring an architect to do the final house. I mean, these things are not that complicated, but what's really lacking is a bigger vision, like the question of prefabrication, the question of, you say that people want personal space, and I agree, but you can do personal space in a multifamily situation. It has been done. Unfortunately, it's been done in other countries, but I think the vision is what's lacking, that we don't seem to be able to see beyond a single family house with a 400 square feet backyard. That may be important. I'm from the East Coast. I live where there was suburban sprawl. And yes, you could sell those. That's what people wanted. I think this is a little bit of a different market, frankly, than the East Coast. This is not your typical market. And I think people are just happy to live here. And if they can live in an apartment that is a decent apartment, they would be fine with that. But I think that the problem is that there's no, where there is no vision, the people perish. And we don't have any means of showing what something could be. That's never engaged in the typical developer situation. What we need is something like a charrette with people that are not going to benefit necessarily from the project, but going to benefit from having a better project in the neighborhood.
I suspect that, well, so this is one of the places where I find myself doing a lot of soul searching, is that I love the Oyster Cove project, and I find I was not terribly happy with the project that Walker brought forward previously. On the other hand, I live in a detached house with a tenth of an acre of lot, and by the time you add the road in to service that, it's probably about 8 houses an acre. So I can talk a lot, but Prop 13 has kind of locked me into, I'm not moving anywhere. So I'm trying to do some soul searching about that. Dave, you got a place to take this?
Oh, I mean, not necessarily. I'm probably the same situation as you are, although I'm living on a 3,000 square foot lot, so I'm probably more if all the homes were like mine, they'd be more like 12 per acre. But I can say, having recently turned 70, this is not where I'm going to live out the last decades of my life. If Walker was delivering a 1,200 square foot home with a 1-car garage, I'd be looking really hard at living there, especially if we could find a way to get transit down to that neighborhood, so I didn't need to worry about driving for the rest of my life. So, and I think that market is growing, but we may not be big enough yet to justify as many homes that we're looking at here.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, some of this is about creating an environment where developers like Walker think they can do something like what we're asking for. And I'm not stepping up to sign up on the pre-purchaser list. That's on me. Jerry, I see your hands up.
Thank you. I want to go back. I put some in the comments just to remind everyone. But I want to actually, Dan, appreciate what you said earlier about shared housing and the Victorian issue. If we're talking about homelessness, or talking about finding affordable housing for people, the homes that are already been built are the homes which are available here in Petaluma. Shared housing. I'm gonna turn my video off because I was having internet issues. But actually, I believe about 20% of the solution. I mean, what Walker and Skinnell and all those folks are doing, not the solution. It really is. It's how to fund it and how to do those things that the 175 billion addresses. But in terms of something that we can do this week, or something that anyone on this call could do, to consider shared housing, or particularly with elders, there are structures that would help to facilitate that, to manage individuals. Shared housing is a really big part of that. In Cott's case, that's integrity housing, where they've done this since 2011 with master leases for community housing. There's a very large number of people who are economically insecure. It's about 95,000 people who are living on just SSI or Social Security alone. So if you want to talk about homelessness, I want to talk about practical solutions that are affordable. All of these things are important. The interface, but Dave, I really liked your drawings you did, but putting social values around all of that. And so for the person who's homeless, for the elder who lived a life of low wages, all of those things, those are where a lot of the solutions lie in terms of housing. Let's take advantage of both the buildings that are already built, and then do the infill stuff that we can do, accessory dwelling units at a much lower cost. There are some solutions for Petaluma that I really hope that we can look at.
Dan, I think we got a question there about would this project have an HOA?
Yeah,
Walker?
we're kind of getting specific to Walker's project, but
Yeah, you're right. You're right. We
it's
are.
okay. We can
Yeah.
talk about Walker's project because clearly I'm
Yeah, fair
I'm
enough.
pro
Yeah.
and con. I'm happy to have Walker pitch his project to us again.
Well, okay.
Yeah, we will have an HOA, but the details of it, I don't know.
Mhm.
Well, having been reminded there by Dan that the conversation is supposed to be about more housing in general, if I could suggest, Dan, that we go back to the Colburn video,
Sure.
beginning at 53:10 and going for about
E&D.
3 minutes. There's a really good question about regulatory changes to accommodate, to create more housing. I think it was a worthwhile message to hear this evening.
Identify
Okay. Hang on. Here we go.
Thanks.
what the key policy barriers are at the federal, state, and local level, but kind of on the flip side as well, are there regulatory changes that would be the most impactful?
So there are a lot. There are a lot of barriers. So I'm going to start local and then go out to the federal side. So I would argue some of the biggest barriers at the local level relate to land use. And generally speaking, and we know this from all sorts of studies and literature on this, that single family homeowners are not big fans of changing zoning in their neighborhoods. And we see this all throughout the country. And so as we think about this need to change the way the built environment looks and exists in communities, that's a difficult political process in the sense that we need to go to single family homeowners and say, we're going to change zoning here. And they say, we don't want apartments in our neighborhood. We don't want those people. And this becomes a huge, huge issue because these are hyper local decisions that are made. And until we get over this, kind of the stigma related to rental housing into multifamily housing, this is going to be difficult. And so we saw this in Washington, right, in this year's session in Olympia, that proposals to change zoning around transit met a lot of opposition. And so I think at the state, local, county level, these are the battles that are going to be fought over the next couple of years. I think ultimately zoning will change in the state because it has to. I think people will come to the recognition that it absolutely will have to. I hope it's sooner rather than later because I think it's absolutely essential. And we've started to see movement around the country. Oregon moved, California moved, the city of Minneapolis upzoned their entire city. They outlawed single family zoning. Doesn't mean they outlawed single family housing. They just outlawed the zoning. And so I would say that those are some major impediments at the state and local level that we're going to continue to have to deal with. At the federal level, frankly, I feel bad for our state and local electeds because housing is expensive, and ultimately the deepest pocket in the United States is the federal government. And for the last 4 decades, the federal government has basically removed itself from the provision of or the support of low-income families in terms of housing. And so only 1 in 5 people who are eligible for federal housing support actually get it. And so in essence, what's happened is we've created this huge problem in the United States. The federal government says, we'll help out 20% of them, and then you guys get to deal with the rest of it. And because of the scale and the costs associated with housing, I think it's fundamentally unfair that the federal government has done that to states and localities. And then people will then go to county commissioners and local electeds and say, well, why haven't you fixed this problem? It's like, well, because it's a really, really big problem and it's expensive. And it'd help a lot if the federal government was actually participating in this. And so I think that's a big challenge. And so the prospects for major action in DC aren't great. And so that will continue to put more pressure on states and localities. And so not only will it be land use, kind of those regulatory levers, but it will also be these difficult revenue conversations in terms of where's the revenue going to come to support households and to construct housing that's affordable. And, that's where the action is going to be in state politics and in the decades to come, assuming that these housing crises continue to burn as they are right now.
So that's the segment that you asked me to play.
Yep. Thank you.
And along those lines, I've got a friend who lives over on the development in between me and Quarry Heights, or in between the Veterans Building and Quarry Heights. And I think he moved in circa 2009. That project was completed around the 2010 time. And I make that snarky comment about, affordable housing is what you built 50 years ago. But he has noted that a couple of houses there have quite a few people living in them. And those are, fairly large, nominally single family, although some of them have in-law units in the back, homes. So maybe it's not what you built 50 years ago. Maybe it's just what you built 10 years ago. I'm scrolling down here.
I think we're in pretty good shape. I mean,
Okay.
I'm sure this conversation could probably go on for another hour or two, but I think we have hit most of the high points we could.
Cool. And we've gotten our hour and a half in
Got
roughly.
an hour and a half. And I hear Walker's kids in the background occasionally indicating they like some attention.
That's fair.
They're just locked in their rooms.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you, Walker, for chatting with us. Thank you, Dave, for putting yet another frickin' book on my reading list.
Hey, thanks for guys. This was a good discussion. Really
Cool.
appreciate the opportunity.
We do have one from Lily Hourigan, and this actually, I think, ties in. She asks, would it be possible to build single-family homes with the intentions of being easily able to renovate them from multifamily? And one of the things that we kind of pushed back to you on in a couple of our interactions was the way that we build neighborhoods to be static. And I know that my neighborhood was built in the 40s and 50s. And when I moved into my house, there was an Electrolux vacuum cleaner in the attic, and it had a sale tag on it from a house on the street. So there's a lot of we're building neighborhoods to be very brittle now. And it feels like we used to build them to be more flexible. And a lot of that's the economics of being able to build single family houses or, single houses at a time and all of that. Can you talk a little bit about the architecture of flexibility? And you mentioned that it's expensive and hard to find tenants for multi-use. Ramble on that for just a few minutes. I think you're muted again. There, yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure I fully understood the question about going from single to multi in the same structure. Could you expound on that a little bit, just so I can
Well, I think,
respond properly?
one of the conversations that we had in the pre-show and is like the way that the old Victorians downtown, sure, some of them are single family, but a lot of them end up with people subleasing rooms. And obviously, the more bathrooms you build, the more expensive it gets. So there's some, challenges there, but building for flexibility, I guess, is.
Okay, so I think the best example I can give is an ADU. At making more homes that are ADU available for an ADU. And I know that's not a good answer. If you can lease out a room or have a room share, and you don't have to have a full kitchen. But I'll just use the ADU example. Kind of going back to what Dave said earlier about the cost of construction and zoning requirements. There's so much that you have to do to include an ADU in a constructed house, and those costs go up. So I don't have any hard examples, but I think in short, the way the code is currently written, a home that has a little more flexibility, at least for an accessory dwelling unit, that cost would be higher per square foot than a home without it. So it's not like we couldn't build more of those. And I think in our January proposal, what we were proposing was adding 31 ADU potential, or out of the 158, 31 would be options to have an ADU in it. So basically, we would have a floor plan where an extra room would have a kitchen. It would already be plumbed. Maybe you don't have to put in all the appliances, but it would all be plumbed. You would have a separate entrance. So all of those zoning requirements would be met, but with the floor plan of the home, but you don't necessarily have to build it. It's the option of the owner. So that's definitely something that we're considering. Will it cost more? Yes. It's kind of like going back to the townhomes. You know, for us, even though it seemed to an outsider who doesn't look at the cost every day, it might seem like putting more houses in a smaller space would be more cost efficient. You have to also look at how much you can sell the home for. And if the price of the home is so much less, it typically offsets the reduced cost to construct it. So yes, I do think there's added flexibility. There are challenges that increase the cost that are probably, that's why we don't just offer that to start with, because it's more expensive. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that we would entertain.
If I unmute myself. All right, with that, maybe then we should call it an evening. Thank you once again, Walker, for your time and your participation.
And thanks to everyone who's here.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Dave, as always, for putting this together and for being more of the face this time. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Walker, were you going to say something?
No, I just said thank you, and I appreciate it, Dave and Dan, for putting it on.
Awesome. Cool.
Thanks.
And we will hopefully see some of you tomorrow at noon at Aqua's Cafe.
Yep.
Cool. Have a good evening, y'all.